Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to another week of Islamicate book reviews with myself, al-Azami, and my colleague at Exeter, Omar Anchassi. I'm delighted to welcome you again to basically this ongoing series. And this week, Omar will be talking about a book by a colleague of mine at the University of Oxford, Yasin Dutton. His book is, sorry, I've got the title just on the tip of my tongue. Omar, perhaps you can...
Early Islam in Medina,
Early Islam in Medina,
Malik and His Muwatta, published by Bloomsbury Press.
And mashallah, it's the third book by Sheikh Yasin, as I like to refer to him. But in a sense, the third book on a very similar theme of the importance of the Maliki madhab and its role in sort of the development of Islamic law. So Yasin Dutton has, of course, established himself as a leading scholar on Malikism, as well as, of course, areas of Quranic studies and various other areas of Islamic studies more widely. But his books have been very much focused on this theme. So, as usual, the format will be Omar will give a broad presentation on the book that will last for about 15 minutes, and inshallah give us a flavor of what the book is about. I will then start to engage Omar in a broader conversation about the book, and hopefully in the last sort of 15 minutes to half an hour, we're happy to sort of I'm happy, Omar, to go on for over the hour, inshallah. We'll be able to engage any sort of audience questions, but if there aren't any, Omar, I'm sure we will be able to sort of have a very interesting engagement on this book. I just on a personal point, Sheikh Yasin is someone whose books I started reading fairly early on in the early 2000s, and found very valuable. And I actually used his first book, which was based on his doctoral dissertation, as a resource for the essay which I submitted when I was applying to Oxford as an undergraduate. So I have a great deal of respect for his scholarship going back decades at this point. So it really gives me a great honor to allow you to sort of present on the book. Please.
Yes, and I've also been influenced by his scholarship in all kinds of ways, especially his first book, which is, I think, an important corrective to, if you like, the traditional academic historiography on Islamic law. And he makes a number of important points. I think subsequent studies in different ways by people like, I'm not always agreeing with him directly, but studies by people like Ahmed Shamsi and Miklos Muriani and so on have validated some of his findings. And perhaps it could be added that some of the views he was pushing against have only weakened over time, partly as a result of this kind of the impulse he provided to look at these revisit these issues again at greater length. Calder's Studies in Early Muslim Jurisprudence, published 1993, I think he points out in the introduction to the book, is basically unsalvageable at this point. And this is a conclusion we can say more about. One of the many findings of the book we can say more about perhaps later. The book is composed of an introduction and 5 body chapters. The chapters explore, I should stress, although Malik is found in the subtitle of the book, and the book does contain a fair amount of discussion of his biography, this is not a biography of Malik. The first chapter is concerned with his life and his intellectual milieu. The second chapter really looks at his teachers. There's a lot of fine-grained, or one could say granular analysis of, throughout the book, but especially in the second and third chapters, which are concerned with Malik's teachers. Where is the material from the Muata coming from? Who is he transmitting from? How many reports, and what kind of reports, and via which isnads, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of that. And the third chapter looks at the transmissions of Malik's Muata and his students. More than 90 people are said to have transmitted the Muata. Of course, only a handful of those survive. I mean, really 3 incomplete versions. I mean, and so on, but we can say more about that. Technically, you can talk of a 4th complete version, although Ahmed al-Shamsi, I should say, has a very recent, very important recent article, the Muata, the Muwatta and its recensions. And he supports and demonstrates some of the conclusions that Dutton touches on here. Of course, Shamsi's article came out later. We will talk more about the various editions and recensions of the Muwatta. The 4th chapter really looks at the concept of amal, which is something he discussed at some length in his first book. And the final chapter really focuses on a number of scholarly controversies between Malik and his interlocutors, the Shafi'i and others, and the Kufans, and also has some kind of broader suggestions. So, very briefly, I think I'll speak about each chapter in turn for 2 minutes or so, having given this hopefully broad and useful overview. Thinking about the Muwatta is our earliest complete formulation or statement of Islamic law. It's also one of our earliest compilations of hadith, and in fact the earliest we have that is organized by subject as opposed to tradent or narrator or rawi. And the Muwatta occupies a very important place in Islamic intellectual history. Shafi'i famously said it was the asah, or the most accurate or reliable of books after the Book of God, the Quran. And the Qadi Ibn al-Arabi and Shah Waliullah both preferred the Muwatta to the Sahihain, Bukhari and Muslim. And it continues to be studied and to attract commentary, notwithstanding its earliness as a source. This makes it quite distinct from other early works produced in the first 2 or so centuries. So Malik is born, according to what seems to be the most correct view, if you like, in 93 or 711 of the Common Era. Many of his sheikhs and teachers are direct descendants of the companions. Many of them are serving judges, or at some point in their careers serve as judges as well. His grandfather, Malik bin Abi Asim, if I'm not messing it up, is said to have been close personally to the Caliph Uthman. Malik is said to have been purely Arab in terms of his lineage, although, as Sean Anthony discusses in a book we had a previous episode on, it seems one reason for the animosity between Malik and Ibn Ishaq is Ibn Ishaq may have impugned or cast aspersions about the Arabness of his lineage. In any case, we don't have much information or material at all about Malik's early life, but he seems to have been teaching already in his early 20s, in the lifetime already of Nafi', the student of Abdullah, or the freed slave of Abdullah bin Amr al-Mawla, who I'll get a chance to talk about. So thinking about Malik's teachers, what do we know about the Muwatta? And when I refer to the Muwatta, unless I'm specifying otherwise, let's say I'm referring to the recension of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi. Right. This is the most widely known and was the first to be printed and so on. According to the Tamheed of Ibn Abdul Barr, whom Dutton draws on quite a lot and supplements and adds to in a lot of ways. Dutton basically tells us the Muwatta contains 791 prophetic hadith. Slightly more, at least half of the content of the Muwatta is non-prophetic material, which really kind of gives you a sense of how early this text is, in a sense. And the prophetic material in the Muwatta is transmitted from 98 sheikhs. Of those, only 15 are the source of 10 or more hadith. So in the rest of the chapter, he gives us biographies of these figures, especially the most important sheikhs and sources of material in the Muwatta. Malik had important teachers whose material does not figure in the in hadith form. So Abdullah bin Yazid bin Hurmuz, he has no hadith in the Muwatta, and somewhat uncritically one could say Dutton accepts this story that I mean, we will talk about methodology and methodological questions at great length. This is an important part of the book, of course, and raises many important questions. But somewhat uncritically, one could say Dutton accepts the story that Ibn Hurmuz kind of prayed that Malik not or mention him in his and so on. Therefore, he doesn't feature in the book. But anyway, so he goes through each of the teachers. Zuhri obviously is responsible for most of or is the most single number of reports of any of Malik's teachers. Zuhri died in 124. He's kind of the major tabi, learned not just in hadith but also fiqh and amal. One could be learned in one field but not the others. Zuhri is responsible for 120 hadith with full isnads. There are 131, I think, if you count everything all together. Followed by Nafi'. I'll mention the first 5 or 6 who are responsible for 50 or more hadith. Right. Followed by Nafi', who is responsible for 80. Then Yahya bin Sa'id al-Ansari for 77. Then Hisham bin Urwa for 57. Then
A'lam.
Then Abul Zinad bin Dhakwan, who was responsible for 54, and finally Zayd bin Aslam, who was responsible for 51. So those are Malik's teachers, and there is more comment on this chapter. More things I could say. Malik's transmitters, the students and transmitters of the Muwatta, as I said, more than 90 people are said to have transmitted the Muwatta. We have, if you count generously, technically speaking, 9 extant versions, 4 of which are complete. I mean, all of these 9 have been edited and published. 4 are complete, and the other 5 are fragmentary. They're not all really, technically speaking, the Muwatta. So very important is the Muwatta of Shaybani, who spent 3 years studying with Malik. As Ahmed al-Shamsi says in his very important article in the most recent issue of Islamic Law and Society, this is really a partial summary and commentary, really. So what does Shaybani...
It's only about a third of the length.
Yeah, so he prunes all of the hadith repetitions. Instead of discussing the Amal and Malik's views, he discusses the Kufan views in Abu Hanifa. Mm-hmm. It's not a totally independent work. It's obviously derivative, but it's not really a transmission of the Muwatta as such. Yeah. Yeah. This is very important because Goldziya and others like Shacht had in the 19th and 20th centuries only 2 versions of the Muwatta to compare. The transmission of Yahya bin Yahya al-Laythi and the transmission of the so-called transmission of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. Now, if you have only these 2 to come up with, you'll come up with the conclusion, well, these texts grew organically and there's no precision in transmission and so on. Yeah. However, this is a very erroneous conclusion because we now have another, there is the version of Abu Mus'ab al-Zuhri, a Medinan. He served as a judge. He's said to have heard the Muwatta 17 times from Malik. We have this in a complete edition. And the final complete edition, if you like, which only came out, in fact, before Dutton submitted the manuscript for his book. So unfortunately, he was only able to examine a few folios of a copy of the manuscript, not the actual full text. Published, I think, in 2018 by Dar al-Gharb al-Islami, edited by, the main editor is Bashar Awad Maruf, the well-known kind of master editor of the Arab world. And he had some kind of contact with him, but of course, because the manuscript of the book was submitted before this edition came out, he wasn't able to consult it. But subsequent consultation of the edition of Ibn Bukayr, which Shamsi has done, in this important article, which I'll be referring to every now and then. What does Shamsi do? Basically, he looks at the complete transmissions of the Muwatta and compares them. Yahya bin Yahya, Abu Mus'ab al-Zuhri, and Ibn Bukayr, and also looks at the transmissions of Malik's material in the Kitab al-Umm. So you can basically extract a partial copy of the Muwatta based on Shafi'i's transmissions of Malik's material in the Now, we know that Shafi'i said to have memorized the Muwatta and have recited it to Malik and so on. He was also an important transmitter. Now, you have 5 other versions that are only partly extant and have been published. Some of these are more extensive, others are very fragmentary indeed. Very briefly, these are Suwaid al-Hadathani. This is an Iraqi recension found, I think, in Qayrawan. The manuscript was found in Qayrawan. You have a very early fragmentary copy. The fragments have been published by Ali bin Ziyad at-Tunisi. Circa, this version is perhaps the earliest we have, circa 150 after Hijrah, so very early indeed. Al-Qanabi, who studied with Malik for more than 20 years, and his version is said to be the most accurate. So that's
I
leaving.
thought that was a fairly full version, the one of Al-Qanabi.
Yes, I mean it's not complete. That's the very fragmentary one is Tunisi. I mean compared to the others, and finally the version of, again, not complete, Muhammad ibn al-Qasim, the guy who was asked in the Mudawan all of these questions by Sahnun. Right. Technically, it's not really a Muwatta, but Abdullah bin Wahab's material he transmits from Malik in various hadith collections and so on. This has been published. This is his own recension of the Muwatta. So these are the versions of the Muwatta we have. And again, this is something we'll have to revisit. The fourth, I should, yeah, sure.
So you're going to talk more about Shamsi's article. I've not read it, unfortunately. But
sure.
I mean,
so the 2 chapters just finally that I haven't commented on are the Amal and this kind of disagreements with the scholars. We can revisit these later in the episode.
No, I was just going to ask about, so Shamsi's trying to sort of develop an text for the Muwatta, but I wonder to what extent, and this is presumably something that both Dutton and Shamsi are entirely aware of and may have commented on. Perhaps you can sort of enlighten me on it. But the texts in that time also get incorporated into later larger texts. So Malik might be transmitting something and that ends up in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad as
Dutton says, in fact, explicitly the 6 books and the Musnad contain substantial material from the Muwatta. Malik taught many of these figures.
Right.
Of course.
So in a sense, it's kind of as a number of scholars have now commented, it's very it's a complex idea of a book at the time. It's very different to what we're thinking about.
Yes, very important to say, and this is really both Shamsi and Dutton, their findings reinforce one another. Of course, Shamsi has more material to draw on because he has access to the recension of Ibn Bukayr, which Dutton didn't at the time. But what do we find? Now, contra figures like Jonathan Brockup and others, it's not the case that Malik had no authorial control at all over the contents of the Muwatta. That's a conclusion you might come to if you were just comparing the Musnad of al-Shaybani and Muwatta of al-Shaybani and Yahya bin Yahya. No, this isn't the case. Now, it is, however, true that this Muwatta, which was taught over several decades, perhaps 3 decades or so, and kind of constantly grew and shrunk and so on, and material was added and material was cut out, was not an authored book in the sense that we would understand that term, where you have a final edition that is published and then disseminated through mechanical reproduction of one form or another, copying or printing in the modern period. No. However, Dutton says, for instance, the versions of az-Zuhri, al-Qanabi and Ibn Bukayr, based on the little bit of Ibn Bukayr he was able to look at, are very, very close. Yahya bin Yahya diverges somewhat more. Now, it's interesting that Yahya bin Yahya is the most popular version because, as Shamsi points out, and I think he looks at maybe 13 or 14 cases of examining the texts one next to the other to establish differences. I mean, Yahya bin Yahya's is not the most accurate transmission. Ibn Bukayr is more precise. However, for other reasons I won't dwell on, Yahya bin Yahya became the most popular and has been printed more than the other ones, and it was printed earlier than the other ones.
It's basically related to the history of the Maliki madhab.
Yeah, so Yahya bin Yahya was from Al-Andalus. It seems he studied with Malik only in the last year of Malik's life. Fierro, as cited in Shamsi's article, if I'm not mistaken, even speculates that he may have not actually met him and would have received the Muata through an intermediary. But this is, that's not something I would agree with. But anyway, he studied in the last year of his life and then transmitted the text in Al-Andalus and spread in North Africa. And so now, so it's not an authored text in the conventional sense, but as Dutton would say, and as Shamsi would, I'm sure, agree, this is some kind of, there is, Malik was teaching from his notes and his students took these down, but, there is something recognizably Malik in all of these recensions, you could speak of family resemblances if you like. Now, I mean, that's an important finding, and it tells us something about the early development of Islamic law. And that's that is significant.
I mean,
now,
in a sense, tells us about the scholarly culture in a way that
indeed
we need to reassess our own assumptions about how scholarship works. And how
so Dutton does, and we should really talk about this a bit more probably. Dutton does invoke what Herbert Berg has referred to as this kind of contrast between the skeptics and the sanguines, especially as it comes to the dating of early texts is concerned. Dutton positions his own contribution in this book as, it's a kind of counterpoint to the skeptics, and it fine-tunes some of the arguments offered by the sanguines. I mean, very clearly, you have this book being transmitted in recensions we have in Al-Andalus, in North Africa, in Egypt, in Iraq, and the Hijaz. You have to be a conspiracy theorist to deny that this text originates with Malik in an obvious way, right? I mean, he doesn't. I don't think he refers to Tawatur explicitly, but he kind of uses this language of they would. It's inconceivable that they would conspire, thousands of miles apart from each other, and how would we, how would they even be able to determine which copies survive in obscure manuscript, in manuscript libraries?
Can I ask just briefly? I mean, this is this argument still? Does it? I mean, Berg wrote this stuff, if I recall correctly, around 2005, right? I mean, it's a while ago.
I mean, Berg wasn't speaking about the Muata specifically. He's offering a more general assessment of the field, and he's certainly on the skeptical side of things, of course.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, in fact, I'm thinking of his edited volume Method and the Theory, which is a bit later, but his book on exegesis is even earlier,
from Ibn Abbas,
and it received a rather scathing review at the hands of one of my teachers, Muhammad Akram al-Nadwi. I don't know if you've ever read that.
I haven't read the review, but I find the book extremely problematic. But anyway, I should probably say something here about methodology.
Yeah. I was just going to say that, if you I was a bit curious that Dutton should still be referencing that sort of an argument, because I don't.
No. I mean, he's again. It's a passing
reference. Does it still have currency? That's my question. Does that?
Well, I mean, again, Berg is not speaking about to the Muwatta specifically, although you can say his arguments have implications for the dating and the transmission of the Muwatta. He's speaking about the field more generally, you could say, and whether it's hadith, whether it's early Islamic legal texts, you do tend to find this binary of. I mean,
Berg is writing, of course, nearly 20 years ago now, and I'm just wondering if it's is it still necessary for the field to argue against that view?
Oh yeah, are you kidding me? Absolutely. I mean,
okay, sorry.
You will always have skepticism about these early texts, and in some sense, skepticism is baked into the discipline. Now, One thing, I mean, I agree with Dutton on a great deal, and it's a very lucid book and extremely important that one read it if you work on Islamic law at all, especially in the early period. And I mean, of course, you could say that some themes and some of his arguments have been recycled from previous work, but he does add the original content as well, of course. It's a short book, only around 120 pages or so, in terms of the actual body of the book. Sometimes he frames the disagreement as Muslim versus non-Muslim, which has a certain validity to it, but I'm also... one should nuance this. So, people are, there are non-Muslims. I think it's more a question of tradition, of intellectual traditions rather than Muslim versus non-Muslim. You have non-Muslim scholars who argue. Nicholas Mariani has done a great deal, and is is rather sanguine about some early Maliki texts, for example. As far as I know, he's not a Muslim. I think it's more a question of intellectual traditions that one belongs to. I mean, Dutton, of course, got his PhD from Oxford, taught at Edinburgh for a long time, and then at Cape Town and so on, and is a Muslim. But in another sense, I mean, he's also clearly part of the Western academic tradition. I mean, whatever criteria one has to decide who is in and who is not, surely he's in. Anyway, so I wouldn't necessarily frame it.
In our
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily frame it as Muslim, non-Muslim. Yes, it is true that. I mean, to be very explicit, and maybe I will one day lose a job or fail at interview because of these comments. If they ever survive. But it is true that we can't deny the Western academic tradition does have a particular history to it and does operate with a particular set of assumptions.
I think that's reasonably uncontroversial these days.
It will get more controversial. Which your colleague Nikolai Sinai, in his introduction to the historical critical study of the Quran, he says, yes, they have these different assumptions, and you can't, in a sense, you have to assume these assumptions. They can't really be proven. They're a prioris.
Right.
So there is a certain, and I think being critical is important and very useful, but I would distinguish between, and it's something Ahmed Shamsi only hints at in his recent book, but one could work it up, and I'm sure he has much more to say on the subject. There's a difference between being critical and being skeptical. And I think there is a huge amount, ridiculous amount, in fact, of scholarship by people who should know better, that is skeptical for the sake of skepticism in our field. I mean, one could give numerous examples without naming names.
Sure,
of scholarship, scholarly claims that are absurd and are far more implausible than the traditional claims that they seek to replace, are based on much more scant evidence, but are received much more warmly purely because they're skeptical of the received tradition. Many examples of this. I mean, so for instance, Sadeghi talks in one of his famous article about the Sana'at palimpsest that he says, look, scholarly views on the transmission history of the Quran simply do not correspond to the evidence we have. And many years after he wrote that article, it's still the case, by the way. I mean, if paleographic and stylistic grounds for accepting early stabilization of the Quranic text, even the kind of Ottomanic story, has only improved, especially in the last 10 years. If you look at the work of people like Marine van Putten and even Michael Cook's 2004 article on the stemma of regional Quran codices and so on, and Haytham Sidqi has this new article on the regional codices and says there were at least 4 of them and they were from here and so how is it then that you can have people, one scholar I won't name, because the radiocarbon dating of the Sana'at palimpsest produce a date range between, say roughly in the first half of the 7th century, was willing to enter, all of this evidence, stylistic, paleographic, and so on, coming together to broadly support at least the outlines of the traditional story of Ottomanic codification of the Quran, or I should say standardization of the Quranic rasm. And he said, or he speculated that, well, maybe that means because part of this dating is before the Prophet's career, that in fact the Quran in some sense pre-existed the Prophet and his Prophet. Is the only way to describe this is stupidity. I mean,
I think that particular scholar, and I think I know who you're talking about, is not really a scholar of the field, right? I mean, he's
no. I mean, many publications respect. This is just one example, by the way, and I could give many others. I mean, why was Christoph Luxemburg, to name, well, that's not a real name, but Luxemburg, I mean, shouldn't have been given any serious attention at all. I mean, this is, as I said, this is skepticism for its own sake. One example, I'll probably make this my last example of skepticism, and one could fill a volume with such examples.
I think there's valuable scholarship to be done in identifying.
Oh, for sure. I'm not. Yeah. Look, I belong to that. In some sense, even more. I belong to the academic tradition. In some sense, even more than I belong to the tradition of ilm, because my exposure to that world is extremely limited.
Right.
So I'm not hostile to this tradition. That in any sense,
right.
I live and breathe that tradition. I was trained in it. But it has excesses that I don't think are acknowledged enough, and Dutton does helpfully kind of flag them up. So the final example I'll give before we move on is one historian who found a report of an Umayyad prince who, according to this report, is traveling around in Medina with some of his companions, and basically he's not aware of that the Prophet is buried in Medina. They pass by his grave and he doesn't know this is the Prophet's grave, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now the report, at least in my view, is clearly aimed at, and this is what even in a skeptical vein one would say, even if it's not historical, it's clearly aimed at discrediting the Umayyads, right? I mean, this caliph doesn't even, or this prince or whatever, a member of this dynasty doesn't even know that the Prophet ﷺ is buried in this place in Medina. I mean, how irreligious are the Umayyads and so on? You can say it's Abbasid propaganda or something like this.
Right.
Instead, and I heard this from the scholar in a talk he gave, and I found it in their book when I read it years later. What does he say? He says that this is evidence that early Muslims disagreed over whether the Prophet ﷺ was buried in Medina or not. And therefore that, the fact of the Prophet's being buried in Medina is subject to doubt and so on. I mean, again, this is skepticism for skepticism's sake. And I think far too much indulgence is shown towards these kinds of views than is really necessary. One could say, on the other hand, as Nikolai Sinai does, that look, these extremely skeptical views are necessary for pushing the field forward. And if you look at the contribution of a work like Hagerism, it's definitely moved the field forward, if for no other reason than the fact that people sought to find better reasons for believing that the broad outline of the traditional narrative of Islamic history is broadly accurate. So yeah, it's driven the field forward. I mean, I do still have these kind of reservations about this extremely skeptical form of scholarship. Anyway, so to speak to two of the chapters of the book that I did not have a chance to touch on. So the Amal, so in this is, as Malik defines it in the Muata, the Amal is the kind of common basis of opinion and what is acted on in Medina. Of course, there were divergent opinions in Malik's Medina, but it is also the kind of Medinan views that were taken as the basis for judgment. So Dutton emphasizes in more than one place in the book that the kind of governors of Medina and the, if you like, political authority do have a role to play in the operationalization of Islamic law. So, for instance, Malik says they're the ones who choose which of the 8 categories of zakah recipient receives zakah, and they determine how much the amilina alayha, the collectors of zakah, receive for their services. So in this chapter, there's a discussion of the amal. This term occurs in its technical sense in the Muata of Yahya bin Yahya, on 45 occasions, and Dutton discusses the 4 different ways the term is used. Of course, one can consult the book of Omar Farouk Abdullah on the terminology, technical terminology Malik uses and its meanings. Incidentally, Dutton points to the book of Omar Farouk Abdullah, Ahmed al-Shamsi's first book on the canonization of Islamic law, and Muhammad Fadil and his collaborator, whose name escapes me, Monet something, his introduction to and translation of the Muata. Dutton situates these 3 works as, in some respects, counterpoints to the generally quite skeptical treatment of early Islamic law that had been the norm. It's still the case, he says, citing Melchett, that, Schacht and Goldziher's views are taken as a point of departure. And of course, this is something Dutton engages with and challenges. In the final chapter of the book, for example, he challenges Goldziher on Malik's, if I'm not mistaken, it's Goldziher, on Malik's supposedly lax attitude to hadith transmission. Now, it's certainly true that the standards entertained by classical hadith critics and embodied in great works like Ibn Salah's hadith manual and so on, these standards would not have been shared by Malik exactly. They crystallized later. So Malik does, of course, report hadith without isnad, and there are lots of marasil and hadith transmission that skips generations and transmitters and so on. But Goldziher criticized Malik on the grounds that he transmitted from, for example, one transmitter by the name of, if memory serves, Urwa bin Udayna. And Goldziher said Urwa bin Udayna is a singer of erotic poetry and not really a serious transmitter, and we have this material on him in the Kitab al-Aghani. Dutton turns around and points out that actually, if you look in the Kitab al-Aghani, it says he was a poet, but also a respected faqih. So even the source Goldziher cites, he says, does not establish his claim. And in fact, Malik doesn't cite him for a prophetic hadith, but cites him for a description of Hajj. فَبُهِتَ الَّذِي كَفَرَ, you could say in that particular mood. So anyway, the final chapter, or 5th body chapter of the book, engages quite extensively with Malik's disagreements with his interlocutors and subsequent Maliki views. Kind of key examples of Malik's.
I do apologize. My internet had some issues.
No worries. I'm just discussing the final chapter, but it was still broadcasting,
please.
so hopefully our viewers got that. So he discusses 4 disagreements of Malik and early Malikism with other schools, jurists, and 4 disagreements of Layth bin Sa'd, who dies in 175. Layth bin Sa'd being a well-known Egyptian jurist, one of the teachers of Shafi'i, who Malik famously corresponds with. There's some discussion one could have about the historicity of this correspondence. Malik reprimands him for not following the amal, and Layth's answer in summary is, well, the Sahaba all received knowledge from the Prophet ﷺ, and then they migrated to the various amsar or garrison towns of the Muslims and continued to teach students and so on. So one cannot confine knowledge to Medina, as it were. There are 4 key points of disagreement that Dutton mentions between Layth bin Sa'd and Malik. I'll just discuss 2 of them, or refer to 2 of them. So, unlike Malik, Layth bin Sa'd held that one can never combine prayers because of rain. And also, unlike Malik, Layth bin Sa'd did not accept one witness testimony with an oath, Yamin ma shahid, or in the opposite order, so Yamin, oath, plus testimony, shahid. Now, what are the 4 issues that he discusses, though, the 4 cases that Malik disagreed with jurists on? Very briefly, not in the order of the book, just in the order I remember them. Zakah on buried treasure, rikaz, versus zakah on mines, tax on mines. Malik says, or Malik rather makes a distinction, unlike the Kufans. He says, you pay zakah on the product of mines, or the produce of mines, as soon as the amount extracted reaches the nisab, and continue to pay it. Unlike rikaz, where you simply pay the khums, the Kufans say, no, you pay the khums on both. The second issue is, dogs, the using water that dogs have kind of used or drank or what have you. Unlike Shafi'i, reported in the Mudawana, Malik says, especially if it's, a bowl or a slightly bigger body of water, perhaps, it's fine. He considers the dogs to be the tawafuna alaykum. Is it this hadith says the? So no, one can use
yeah.
He considers dogs.
Is a hadith of cats,
but he considers the dog to be equivalent to cats, basically. To be those who go among you in houses and so on. So domesticated dogs. I mean, say so.
The hadith in Bukhari is basically كانت الكلاب تدبر وتقبل على مسجد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فما كانوا يرشون شيئا من ذلك.
Yes. But the key point is this: Malik, unlike Shafi, and indeed unlike the other schools and jurists, has this particular view on dogs and the impurity or lack thereof.
The Maliki say, كل حي فطاهر ولو إبليس لعنة الله عليه.
Very amusing. And also another case, Ihya al-Mawat, or reviving dead land. This idea that if one invests in and builds in land that is not cultivated, one comes to own it. Specifically in the case of dead land, if you like, that is near settled areas. Malik says, in order to assume a title to such land, you need the permission of the imam or the ruler, even if you've cultivated. And so on, Shafi'i says, no, the rule applies across all cases. It doesn't need the opinion of the imam, even if you're farming a dead plot of land next to, or an uncultivated plot of land next to someone else's property. If it's dead and you cultivate it and you meet the conditions, it's yours. You don't need the imam's permission. The imam cannot forbid or cannot give you something that does not belong to him. And so that's three of the issues. The final issue he discusses is something else that currently escapes me, and I'll probably remember tomorrow morning in the shower or something. Sure. Anyway, so I should say finally before in an earlier chapter, the one on Malik's teachers, if I'm not mistaken, in his intellectual milieu, Dutton discusses, and he's explaining how it's the chapter in the Amal, the fourth chapter. He explains how the Amal serves as a kind of lens through which scriptural texts are read. So the cases are ila, or a person who takes an oath not to have intercourse with his wife for 4 months or more. There are two views in Medina, and Malik says the Amal is, so he bases his view on the Amal, this is how he reads the verse, that after the 4 months have expired, the separation does not, or divorce does not occur automatically. The husband is asked whether he will go back on his vow or not. Secondly, ihsar, based on, so this idea of, based on the ayah, فَإِنْ أُحْصِرْتُمْ فَمَا اسْتَيْسَرَ مِنَ الْهَدْيِ. So what happens if you're restricted for various reasons through enemy military threats or something from completing your Hajj? What do you do in terms of sacrificial animals and so on? Based on the Amal, Malik reads this verse and makes a distinction between so the verse doesn't make a distinction between causes of ihsar, of restriction. Right. But Malik makes a distinction between enemy action and other causes. And says, if the causes are the causes, then you simply wait until you get to Mecca, and then you until the Kaaba, and so on, and proceed. And finally, an issue much beloved to Dutton, qabd versus sadl. Qabd being the holding of the hands in prayer, sadl leaving them on one side. This is an issue he revisits in the conclusion. Now, in the conclusion, and Osama, I will make this my last point because I've been,
That's
before, yeah, and
No
hopefully
problem
the
at all.
episode will be a bit
And
longer.
I have to apologize about the state of the internet at my place.
No worries. So, not Malik, Dutton acknowledges there are more than 30 hadith in the well-known collections affirming that the Prophet ﷺ used to pray qad, holding his hands somewhere, right upon left. And Dutton says, however, that the amal is clearly otherwise. Malik himself and the view of the madhab according to Sidi Khalil's Mukhtasar is that one prays sadl with hands down by the sides, which is also, he's careful to point out, the view of all Shi'i groups and the Ibadis. They pray sadl. So one of the points he emphasizes, although he does embrace Islamic legal pluralism, and this is not a manifesto for Malikism, which has been accused of doing in some previous books, especially in this extremely uncharitable review of his second book by Haddad. Anyway, he points out somewhat fairly that the amal, or at least some of the time I would qualify this statement, the amal is somewhat freer from the vicissitudes of transmission, liability for forgetfulness and other mistakes in transmission. Of course, one could give
quite strongly in his first book, of course.
Of course, and he has an article specifically on qabd versus sadl. One can give rejoinders, as indeed he cites the Shafi'i doing. And one of the valuable points of the book is there are sometimes quite extensive and nice, lucid translations of early primary sources that I think is valuable and make the book is suitable for assigning chapters of to undergrads. Very lucidly written.
Well, I mean, first let me apologize for I seem to be having some serious internet issues. So if this keeps on derailing conversation, I apologize in advance. But I hope that I've done something to sort of prevent that from happening. But unfortunately, can't guarantee that. But
well, you know me, I can talk all day if you leave me alone.
No, I mean and it's not exactly what you're saying is sort of filler. It's actually extremely valuable what you're adding, and so I'm very grateful to have you as my sort of conversation partner here, Omar, and that it's me with the internet trouble and not yourself. So when it comes to, an earlier point that it's escaped me now, but just on the point that you've made with respect to the way in which someone like Dutton may be critiqued for taking the party line of the Malikis, for example. I mean, good scholarship, as Devin Stewart points out, it can be somewhat partisan, right? I mean, you can like one side of the argument, and I think great scholars have done that. In the past.
I mean, if you're, I wouldn't, I wouldn't go that far and say, oh, it's just a manifesto for not at all. I mean, if it's partisan, it's partisan in an extremely learned way. And it's not as if, by the way, it's not as if the people who would accuse him of being partisan are themselves partisan in a different way.
So this is my point. I mean, this goes back to the earlier point that you were making. You were sort of complaining about certain tendencies within, certain subsets of the field that will entertain the absurd because it conforms to...
Solely because it contradicts the traditional narrative.
Contradicts the tradition. And I mean, what's unfortunate about that is it's so lacking in self-awareness at times. And I'm grateful that actually increasingly, that self-awareness is coming to the fore. And it's inevitable because, like Jewish studies or, the study of patristics in theology departments, increasingly the participants within Islamic studies are coming from that tradition itself. And I think that's only an enriching feature of the scholarship.
This is an excellent point. I would say like and unlike Jewish studies. Like because insiders engaging in the discourse and training and so on. Unlike why? There's a major divergence. The Wissenschaft des Judentum, or the science of Judaism, the kind of, if you like, the academic study of the Jewish tradition,
Yeah.
emerged in the late 18th and especially in the 19th century. And from the outset, unlike the academic tradition of Islamic studies, Jews were involved. Jews were involved. In fact, in the 19th century, some of the key figures, in fact, many of them also had played a role in Islamic studies in the 19th century. The famous Abraham Geiger, was one of the key architects of Reform Judaism, and partly his views were based on his scholarly findings and his research on the history of Judaism. Also, Goldziher was a Jew in the Reform tradition.
Right.
And notwithstanding a lot of the criticism that's directed, this guy's an Orientalist, you might find, especially in the Muslim majority world today, Goldziher was kind of an Islamophile, really. I mean,
right.
He not just in terms of praying in al-Azhar, praying Jumu'ah in al-Azhar and saying internally, I'm a Muslim, all this stuff he says in his Taghabuch. But I think one can speak about the merits and demerits of doing psychohistory, as it were, but
Sure.
I really think he asked himself at some point, should I, am I a Muslim or am I not a Muslim? Because, he has this comment that, I decided that instead I should try to raise Judaism, modern Judaism, up to the same intellectual as these Muslims and so on. So, but he remained an Islamophile, and if you read him in his context, notwithstanding his critical comments about the tradition, he is an Islamophile. I mean, unlike many other scholars, by the way, in the 19th century, even Abraham Geiger, with this 1833 essay, essentially arguing that here's what the Prophet ﷺ borrowed from the Jewish tradition, an important kind of a landmark text, but nonetheless. He defended the sincerity of the Prophet, for example, which not all European scholars in the 19th century did. So Muslims have only slowly got on, because they have their own very rich, superlatively rich intellectual tradition, and also because of the power dynamics of colonialism, only in beginning of the late 19th century, but of course at a much more advanced rate and much more sophisticated way today, or they're engaging in in this Western academic tradition and belonging to it. I mean, this is why, again, I would say I wouldn't frame the disagreement in terms of Muslim, non-Muslim, where those of us trained in the academy are participants in the same discourse, even if we may disagree.
But in addition, you made a reference to Nikolai's sort of essay in the handbook, Oxford Handbook of Abrahamic Studies or Abrahamic Traditions.
Yes.
I mean,
in a previous episode, but he says it again in the Quranic historical critical introduction.
Right, historical introduction to the Quran. I mean, the reality is that we work within certain assumptions that are. I mean, this is an observation made by Alistair McIntyre and Charles Taylor and other people, and it should be widely recognized now. But it's kind of
we operate within traditions. Yeah. You're never outside the tradition.
We operate within traditions, but those traditions, I mean, crucially, those traditions are all analogous to each other in that we can't fundamentally sort of like prove the foundations of
in some sense, they're incommensurable. One could say. Now, I should say, the idea of objectivity, of course, has been criticized a lot. I mean, there are more nuanced visions, as Ahmed Shamsi said in one place, of what objectivity is. In some sense, you have to be committed to a notion of shared standards. Exactly what those standards is up for debate. But you should be able to speak across traditions in terms that your interlocutors will understand. Now, of course, you're not going to agree on even some fundamental issues. But I mean, for example, there is certainly, as Dutton suggests, there is dogmatism in a good amount of dogmatism, in fact, in the Western academic tradition as far as the study of Islam is concerned.
But I would extend it far beyond I would extend it far beyond the study of Islam, because
of course.
In the sense that, like, all of you've probably heard.
I mean, it starts with a critical standpoint vis-a-vis the kind of Western intellectual tradition of the transmission history of the Hebrew Bible or what have you.
In a kind of Durkheimian sense, or in a sense that goes back to someone like Ibn Taymiyyah and Qaida fil Mahabba and the notion of, what is a religion. The reality is, in order for a society to function, it has to have some kind of overarching ideology, whether it's, in a society like this, broadly speaking, liberalism or sort of secularism. And once you've, got that, you have to be dogmatic about it in order for society to work. Now, the problem that I have with the academy
criticism is left to a few, intellectuals in the groves of academe.
An example I often give is, look, within academia, we recognize in, the dominant position in neuroscience is that we don't have free will, but we certainly don't apply that as a standard in the legal department, in the law faculty, right? And so at the end of the day, the law department has to be quite dogmatic about the fact that, people have free will.
But I think us academics really flatter ourselves in terms of the influence we have on society.
Right.
We are in fact quite cloistered and speaking to each other more than to the outside.
Yes and no. I mean, the thing is, certain departments, the humanities certainly are cloistered. Okay, but certain departments are deeply integrated into the way in which society runs, and justify and legitimate and provide the ideological glue that keeps us.
There is, if you like, using Shafi'i's term, a kind of khabar al-'am and khabar al-khas distinction as well, as far as academic knowledge and society, broader society.
But I mean, this. One of the comments that you made earlier reminded me of a remark made to me by a very eminent historian when I was an undergraduate. He was based in Britain at the time. And he basically said to me, he knew that I was of a Muslim background, and he was saying, look, and he gave me Ibn Warraq and a bunch of other skeptics to read. And he basically said to me, look, I just did this as an exercise after I wrote the essay so that you would, be forced to grapple with, you'd be challenged about your assumptions about your tradition. I wasn't very much, but that's a slightly different story. And
he could have chose a better author than Ibn Warraq.
Well, I mean, he was taking Ibn Warraq's collected, editions.
This
of all
edited volume,
edited volumes. Now, but then he also revealed his assumptions in the process of the tutorial. I kind of sort of had a voluntary tutorial with him, and he was saying, look, every tradition that we have studied has been shown up to have invented its early history. Why should we assume Islam is any different? Okay, so he's saying Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, etc. That's a great assumption, but it's not based on anything sort of other than that.
No, but I would then turn around and say, well, please show the same amount of criticality towards your own assumptions and this tradition. Right. What bothers me is
naturalism embedded.
What bothers me, fine, okay, use this language of objectivity. As I said, we have to, at some level, we have to buy into some level of whatever objectivity is.
No, that's fine.
We can debate about what it means, but okay, then please show some self-awareness about your own tradition. It's one of the things I love about Jonathan Brown's, the Hadith book, and also to some extent misquoting Muhammad. He parochializes this Western historical critical tradition. Right. It's a tradition like any other, with its own series of assumptions that you may disagree with, and so on. Now, what really bothers me is when people show, because it's the kind of operating ideology. Of course, we can't ignore the fact it's also married to power, right? I mean, in itself, that gives tremendous prestige. If you get a PhD from Oxford, or from Queen Mary, right? Maybe to a lesser extent from Queen Mary, but
University of London is very respectable.
But just because I'm obviously that's where I came from in a sense. Right. And then let's say you go to the Muslim majority world, solely by virtue of the fact you graduated from these institutions. What you say has prestige, even if it's rubbish. Absolutely. And because of this kind of background, because of the power dynamics and the psychology of it all, there's far too much deference. It's even worse in the Muslim majority world in a sense. But this lack of self-awareness you find within the Western academy. This willingness to entertain sometimes very extreme, almost absurdist levels of skepticism. About the Prophet's son-in-law, not mentioning any names, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for example, with, this is based on one mistake in a corrected scribal error in an early Quranic manuscript, and then kind of turning the whole of the history on its head and saying X, Y, Z. I mean, it's kind of like reaching around, around this side of, my problem with certain forms of revisionist scholarship, and I'll kind of, you can let you intervene at this point, was brilliantly highlighted by Montgomery Watt, whose, of course, style of scholarship is no longer really doable in our, post-Hagerism and post-sectarian milieu. His review of Hagerism, which I think is the best review of Hagerism I read. The problem is, it kind of, this approach overturns it's not, I'm not saying this because I happen to be a Muslim. Right. This approach overturns the canons of reason itself, whatever those are, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It reaches a point of almost, Pyrrhonian skepticism. In one review essay, and I've referred to Ahmed al-Shamsi a lot in this episode because, he does discuss these early things on, I forget, which review essay of it is, but he says, he effectively says, paraphrasing, for some people, we will not be able to know that the Quran has some kind of, originated in the lifetime of the Prophet unless, or with the Uthmanic code of standardization, unless we have, 2 signed copies by Zayd bin Thabit that are complete, and, not just one copy, but 2 of them, and they're signed by Zayd bin Thabit and dated, and, all of this other. That's not how historians work in almost any period. Very naive, deliberately naive, willfully naive, to the point of.
Yes, I mean, there's the series of verses and that conclude Subhanaka hal kuntu illa bashar rasula, right? Like, if you were to bring this and that and that and that and that, then maybe we'll believe you, right? And there's something amusing about the applicability of those sorts of verses.
Continue and then if you can try to continue the ayah. So if you're able to bring a kitab fi qirtas, and then they'll come up with another reason.
سكرت
I forget, and I don't want to misquote it, of course. Yes, but I mean, with some people, this is the level you reach. Now, this is the tradition I belong to in terms of my training, and in terms, that's how I put bread.
But I mean, to bring it back for a moment, Omar, to Professor Dutton's book. I mean, I think what Professor Dutton's doing, Sheikh Yasin, is doing in a way which reflects the struggles potentially of an older generation of Muslim scholars within the academy that I actually feel a lot more empowered about doing myself. I mean, I very openly, inform my students and my colleagues. I'm trained as an alim, and I wear that hat. In various other contexts, but it's actually something which I think is legitimate to, speak in the name of within this academic setting as well. Yeah. And I ask, why is it that we are still colonized enough as Muslims to be prevented from identifying our own? So, this is the decolonial lens, so speaking. It has it. I mean,
you and others have pointed out in previous conversations that, one can be in the academy a feminist and argue from feminist perspectives and adopt this as the lens through which one reads the whole of history and other disciplines. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, why not being a Muslim? Not to argue there's a kind of monolithic, understanding of what that would entail necessarily.
Of course.
But I mean, but the prejudice is still I wouldn't say ubiquitous. It's still very, very common, of course.
But even that, common. I mean,
especially in elite institutions.
I agree, but I also think, like, I was having a conversation with someone who, he works in the policy world. He completed his PhD in sort of liberal and political theory in 2010 at the University of York, and I was talking to him about Alistair McIntyre, and he said, I remember when someone like McIntyre was brought up in our department, when I was a doctoral student, he would be perceived as completely, like, being the literal word he used was bonkers. And I think that this is true sometimes in disciplinary settings, but what happens now is that people like Alistair McIntyre, people to a certain extent like Charles Taylor, in my view, someone like Alvin Plantinga, I don't think
in
Josh,
a very
your
different
colleague, is
field,
a big
of
fan.
course.
But they're in very different fields. But
Yeah.
there are ideas that emerge in those sorts of fields, which are drawn on by great scholars like al-Azami. Whatever we think of his competence in the pre-modern tradition, when it comes to thinking about some of these methodological questions, in thinking about how Muslims can participate in these fields, they can help provincialize what Alvin Plantinga calls methodological naturalism, like the assumption that in order for you to engage in science or in scholarship, so to speak, that you have to adopt methodological naturalism. Has been brought into question by people like Alvin Plantinga very forcefully when it comes to.
I mean, unfortunately,
sort of
this is not not a debate I'm Plantinga specifically.
Yeah, no, that's
very
perfectly
familiar
okay.
with.
But
I would say this, since I've been criticized, and especially among older scholars, one does still find an attitude, dealing with Muslims as even those trained in the Western academies, though they're uppity natives, for want of a better term. Fortunately, that is becoming less and less common, but I'm sure Dutton had struggled with it a great deal in the 90s.
If you look at the way in which Joseph Schacht responded to Fazlur Rahman's writings, right? And Fazlur Rahman was on the defensive in that sort of setting because of how...
The irony being, Fazlur Rahman conceded almost everything to Schacht, and yet for Schacht it wasn't good enough.
But again, Fazlur Rahman...
In his review of Islamic methodology and history,
despite his, the brilliance of his mind, we have to remember the 19th century...
Well, he overcompensated, evidently.
He did, but, we were still living in the time where things like logical positivism were taken seriously, right? I mean, where the notion that, if you're talking about metaphysics, you're literally talking about nonsense, right? And those sorts of things, we live in an era, 70 years after W.V. Quine writes his famous, destruction of logical positivism, in a very short essay. I'm not very well read on the history of the philosophy, but someone like Quine and questioning the sort of distinction between the analytic and the synthetic as ideas that are fundamental to the analytic philosophical tradition brings into question the certainties with which people, the certainties that were so overwhelming that someone like Fazlur Rahman, who's a brilliant mind in my estimation, felt the need to overcompensate in that way. I don't feel that need in the slightest, right?
Yes, but we should acknowledge that, as you would, I'm sure, that we live in different times, and
we live in
the field has really transformed. I mean, the field has not only transformed. One thing that I was saying to a friend yesterday, I mean, it's grown immensely. Just to give you, in a very vivid sense, how much the field has grown. Maxim Romanov, who is the Sheikh of Islamic Digital Studies, has said that the amount of scholarship on Islam in European languages until the year 2000, so from the beginning until the year 2000, European languages, is now exceeded by the volume of scholarship produced since the year 2000.
I mean,
so anyone, including Dutton, of course. I mean, anyone who even received their graduate training in the 1990s inhabits, in some sense, or they grew up at least in a different world of scholarship, one where Muslims were not interlocutors, or unless they were editing primary sources, they were another who need not be addressed. How is it that in Hagerism, Cook and Kroner said by infidels for infidels? They assumed the audience, and it was true, and they were writing overwhelmingly. The book was not going to be read by, say, Muslim graduate students, for example. Sure. And of course, that's no longer the case.
Of course. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that that's a very valuable insight. That just the literature means that. We still end up using Schacht's introduction to Islamic law.
No. I mean, the introduction maybe is outdated. I mean, it's a classic which people should be reading, obviously. Of course, Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, every student of Islamic law should read, and it should be one of the first things they read. I mean, I disagree with nearly everything he says. The major points, the idea that, the Quran wasn't important in early Islamic law and that the prophetic sunnah, there's a lot of stuff that even when reading it struck me as slightly odd. And I think he seriously misunderstands. And perhaps we can riff off this point to say more about Dutton. I mean, Schacht obviously, to me at least, he's and of course very learned and knowledgeable in the sources, clearly misunderstands what Malik is doing. If Malik gives you a hadith, I think he mentions 2 hadith on qabd in prayer, and yet says, the amal is different and therefore we pray. I mean, that doesn't mean Malik doesn't afford any importance to prophetic sunnah. Why the hell does he care about Medina in the first place? It's not that Medina was the city.
The Muata is a bit confusing on Qabd, and I've not read.
Of course,
work,
but I mean, just to use an example, and so Dutton says it's a kind of non-textual transmission and operationalization and interpretation. This is what the amal is. Yeah. It's a kind of lens through which you read scriptural text based on, supposedly, this is the claim, I mean, the Malikis would make, as Qadi Iyad acknowledges, as cited by Dutton in his Madarik. All of the other jurists are against us as far as the amal is concerned. They won't defer to this principle. There are Shafi'i says in this, he translates this wonderful line. When Shafi'i is expressing his frustration with what he regards as inconsistent approaches to hadith and even use of amal in Malikism and among in the Muata and so on, this amal of yours, we don't know what it means, and perhaps in our lives we'll never know what it means, or words to this effect. You're so and other early jurists, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, of course, also expressed what he saw as frustration with what he saw as this inconsistent use of hadith and even inconsistent use of amal. Malik's interlocutors and subsequent critics were happy to point out that actually Medinans diverged quite a lot on specific issues. And, why is the opinion of a governor of Medina a better basis for a legal opinion than a musnad hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that is soundly transmitted, right?
But I mean,
so one can give all kinds of other answers.
Doesn't address at all the sort of, the canonical sort of response of Malik to, I believe it was Harun al-Rashid who wanted to,
this story isn't referenced in the book at all.
Because
I mean, it's not.
I mean, that's important also in the sense that, Malik is making claims, but he's also recognizing the pluralism, and insistently recognizing the pluralism of the Islamic tradition. Yeah,
I mean, whether or not we accept the historicity of this story,
Ibn Taymiyyah considers it to be authoritative, so I do feel.
But I would say the important point here is to bear in mind what Shamsi has discussed in his first book: the fact that, I mean, Malik's project is very different from a Shafi'i's. Malik is, Malik is still very much of this highly localized transmission of law and hadith.
Right.
And if you like, or if you want to put it, in this way, Shafi'i's vision and his horizons are much broader.
Universalist.
And he is a text, he's a universalist, and he's concerned with texts, and he wants to kind of make the study of Islamic law, if you like, a more objective enterprise, or the pursuit of Islam, a more objective enterprise. Yeah. I should say, returning to this point about skepticism, I mean, of course, one would be remiss not to acknowledge that Muslims can also be dogmatic about history, of course,
Sure.
And the tradition itself, in figures like Ibn Taymiyyah, would be the first to point this out. It's still the case that many Muslims take pretty much for granted the idea that all of the sermons in Nahj al-Balagha and all of the text in Nahj al-Balagha is Ali's. Now, and it's not a sectarian thing. I mean, there are Sunnis also regarded highly. And so now, even though there's no, not to mention no isnad and no earlier manuscripts, but basically a Sharif al-Radi coming along in the 4th century of the Hijrah. He dies in the 5th. These are sermons from Ali, and we do have references to certain speeches by Ali and Ibn Nadim and what have you, but there's basically no evidence at all for this claim at all. I mean, some of the Arabic may be early. That's great, but attribution to Ali. I mean, there's no evidence for this at all, and yet some people will still defend it. And this is an example of dogmatism.
Is there a good study of it? I know that Nahj al-Balagha, is generally, at least within the Sunni tradition, seen as not going back to.
I think there is some. You can certainly find Sunnis who endorse the attribution historically. And writing commentaries, of course, as well.
In the modern sort of like more hadith oriented era, I think that
that stuff won't survive for a second in this hadith, post al-Bani age.
Is there any secondary study of this? Incidentally, I'm just wondering.
There are. I mean, even since it comes to mind. I haven't seen anything systematic in the European languages. I'm aware of defenses of the authenticity. So, Buzurg al-Tehrani, the famous author of the Ri'a ila Tasanif al-Shia. No, it's there's different works. You're thinking of the Ri'a ila Makarim al-Sharia of this other, totally different. But no, Tehrani was this, and he also writes Tabaqat. He's a major scholar of the 20th century and a brilliant. Everyone who works on Shi'ism is dependent. I mean, I'm familiar with his work because I work on Shia Usul al-Fiqh at the moment. I work on Shia Usul al-Fiqh at the moment, so I have to engage with. It's a great work. I mean, he has a spirited defense of the authenticity of this work that's not persuasive at all. It would only persuade people looking to be persuaded. But in any case,
I'm a bit conscious that
of
we
time.
have had a couple of comments. No, I mean time. I'm relatively flexible.
Sure,
but I've had a.
So yes, let's engage with comments.
Well, I mean,
but I just wanted to end by saying that yes, certainly dogmatism is found among Muslims as well, and that ought to be challenged.
Right.
Not just from an academic point of view. I mean, in some cases, I should say, I was surprised to see a friend recently in an article he sent me to read cite Van S accepts the attribution of the Musnad al-Rabi' ibn Habib to al-Rabi' ibn Habib. Whereas al-Albani, on the other hand, so he dies, I think, 175 or something like this. It's a very early Abadi hadith text, or purports to be. Now, it survives only in a recension by our friend al-Warjalani, who we saw in the episode on Nabil Hussein's book, who dies in the 12th century, 6th Hijri century. Now, al-Albani, his discussion of this book is extremely entertaining and actually more critical in the sense of more negative than Van Es. So what does he say? Al-Rabi' ibn Habib is a majhul, he's unknown. And, there's basically no evidence this book exists in that period, and he compares the transmission of this book to Alf Layla wa Layla in his very critical way. So it's not that Muslims are incapable of, and Al-Albani's criteria for doing so are purely internal to the Muslim tradition. They have nothing to do with modern academic scholarship.
But at the same time, I mean, like one wonders, or at least I would wonder, is Albani to a certain extent going to be
biased?
Yeah, because of the source being an
Ibadi.
Sorry, Ibadi.
But no, I mean, but the things he says, I mean, he's not inconsistent.
Yeah.
What do you do if you have a book attributed to a majhul person that he says even their own tabaqat works have no information on? No real information.
No, I mean, I'm just sort of highlighting. It's really interesting the politics of sort of identifying bias, because the assumptions that you would find in the writings of the generation of Shaht would be that Muslim sources would be biased, but now we can also point out, okay, well, we have the awareness that can be the case, but we also have the I hope increasing awareness that Western sources, of course, have their own biases as well, and hopefully that's something which is...
Of course, I know. I know it's a very hackneyed phrase now, and it's even the motto of what's this? I don't know why I'm forgetting this. The institution Sheikh Akram graduated from.
Darul Ulum Nadwatul
Darul
Ulama.
Ulum, yeah, Nadwatul Ulama, yeah. Their theme is, I forget, it's like al-Jadid, al-Nafi' wal-Qadim. Basically, this idea that you should marry the two. I mean, it's hackneyed and it's trite and it's repeated all the time, but it's true. Someone, I think it would be extremely wrong to deny that one can and should be enriched by both intellectual traditions at the same time.
Absolutely. We have actually a number of... so let me just begin, if it's all right. This is it's over an hour ago now, but our good friend Black Viper gives salams. Wa alaikas salam. And Ziryab Jamal has a number of, I guess, questions and comments. So
it seems these messages are not in the right order, but anyway, I get the point he's trying to say. Yep.
So this is from a good 20 minutes ago. He said most of the early Islamic secondary and tertiary sources were the products of power, reactionary romanticism that is prevalent amongst the laity, ignores the core legal concepts were not understood. I'm not
really sure with that. Perhaps we can focus on the second comment unless
sure. So this is something
which is clearly part of one.
Take the enigmatic idea of Kalala, for example. Pavlovich utilizes a modified isnad matn analysis, studying 29 clusters, and concludes that most of the traditions...
if you jump to the third message, the next one.
Most of the traditions were developed in the course of legal and exegetical debates between second century jurists.
And if you skip to the last one where he continues...
Okay, so he says...
the final...
He argues that only a handful of these may be dated, though with considerable degree of uncertainty, to the last decade of the 7th century. I'm not familiar with Pavlovich's engagement with this.
So he has a book on Kalala. He's a very interesting chap. I saw an interview with him. He's a Bulgarian scholar based in Sofia. He was one of the first in this then communist country to be permitted to study humanities, and he studied in Iraq because Arabic is exceptionally good. But it was a period when the communist world was opening up, as it were, and normally they had no problem with sending people to study languages, but humanities, because as we've pointed out, because there are all of these assumptions involved. But anyway, he was one of the first scholars from Bulgaria to do this, study history, and I think in the University of Baghdad. Anyway, so yes, Kalala. So yes, I'm. So I mean, Dutton says. Ziryab's point has made me think of this. Dutton actually says, well, we might even say that certainly using Western hadith assumptions about hadith and so on, written transmission of hadith, we may not be able to push back using these methods before or much before 100 after the Hijrah. Not least because, as he points out, the actual tradition of writing down and documenting hadith and circulating these public documents, this is a late 1st, early 2nd century phenomenon in the first place. You do not have paper really until the second half of the 2nd century, or at least it doesn't become widespread. So it's not surprising that the fact the tradition itself acknowledges that transmission in the 1st century and a half of the Hijrah was overwhelmingly oral, and if you had writing, it was in the form of private notebooks. I didn't mention it last week for some reason, but because Ingalls does refer to Gregor Scholler's distinction between singramata, plural, the singular singrama, and hyponyma, private documents and notebooks and so on, versus public authored works and books intended for circulation. In Qut al-Qulub, and I've mentioned this in a previous episode, as cited by Ghazali, Abu Talib al-Makki says, the first books were written in 120 or 150, something like this. This is what one would expect for a situation where it takes between, I forget the exact figure, but between 120 and 150 sheep to produce a single mushaf. That imposes major constraints and on what can be done. I took that from a lecture by Fred Donner, Ahmed al-Shamsi, I forget. So of course things will change,
Yes.
and as Shamsi has documented, the actual even the nature of Islamic law and Islamic legal discourse transforms, and the transition from the oral to the written is a big part. Not to say the written transmission didn't play a role at all prior to this, but this transformation transforms the tradition, as it were.
I mean, I've got these kind of random questions, and I wonder if you'd have the time to entertain them. I'll
Sure.
put them to you, but you can sort of think whether
Yeah.
it's suitable in this particular context. So,
Yeah.
In his famous article about sort of the refusal to write down traditions, opponents of writing in the Hadith corpus. The conclusion's interesting, and I'm saying this from memory of something I've read a few years ago now. But he basically says there were a number of choices to be made when it came to, preserving a tradition, and the choices that the Muslim community made were very useful for, it was the adoption of a written form, if I recall correctly, that ultimately prevailed, of course. But the impression I got was oral traditions also have ways of preservation. So, like the Pentateuch, or the Bible as a whole, has a kind of coherence to it, even though it's heavily oral in its transmission. Right?
Yeah, but I mean, it was edited. It was edited anyway. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I've got a colleague here in the Institute for Arab and Islamic Studies, Christine Robbins, who worked on the mysterious sect known as the Mandaeans. This kind of priestly, they're not Christians and they're not Muslims. It's a separate, distinct religious tradition that survive in Iraq. People. No, that was a Jewish sect. These are Mandaeans, and the ritual purity is very important to them, and much of their ritual life centers around preserving and maintaining and restoring ritual purity. But many of their traditions are oral, and there are only a handful of these priests left, and we need to document, otherwise it will die out, and this information will be lost to historians. I mean, another example of course, the question of oral versus written is also a debate about authority and transmission of authority. Mm-hmm. And I'm not original. People have already pointed to Plato and his kind of comments on this. The Druze. I mean, I had a colleague who used to be here who worked on the Druze, and his study was based entirely on manuscripts preserved in Western manuscript libraries, because it is a notoriously secretive, at least the religious elites, the sheikhs of the Druze, secretive, and it's transmitted orally, and outsiders do not see the kind of writings and so on. Right. And that's fine if you live in a tiny mountain community and you're very insular and you do not accept converts and you only marry inside the religion, as is the case of the Druze. And in fact, you accept something that seems bizarre from a sort of universalist Muslim perspective, a very rigid distinction between Juhal and Uqqa. Anyway, normal the commoners, as it were, are just left in their ignorance, and this isn't seen as problematic in any way. Or anyway. And the reason they were able to survive is because they lived in this fairly isolated region, and until the modern period, they were somewhat safe from. And I know your colleague Christian Sana is working now on these, mountain communities and other people living in remote places, and this kind of pattern we see across the Muslim world, the Middle East and so on, mountainous and desert regions and so on. So. Right. But if you are going to be a sort of universal tradition, and Shafi'i is a kind of universalizer, if you like, versus the traditions of the local schools, or the ancient schools, as Shakhdus called them, none of that makes any sense at all. And this is why he's involved in kind of the creation of, if you like, objective standards of Islamic legal scholarship, because it's a republic of letters. It's no longer the parochial tradition, not in a derogatory sense of Malik, where your teachers are from Medina and they transmit material in Medina, and your outlook for the most part is kind of your horizons are fairly narrow. It's not like a later generation where they would travel to Yemen and Iraq and Egypt or wherever to collect hadith. That's a later development.
Yes, I mean, Malik famously said, like, people should come to Medina. We don't need to go anywhere, right? It's fascinating. I mean, because, of course, the Maliki madhab, like the Shafi'i madhab, becomes this sort of quite widespread madhab in North Africa, and it is basically in the Muslim West.
I mean, Dutton points out that by the end of the 5th Islamic century, Malikism is basically not really there anymore in the East. So kind of, I imagine he means East of Egypt. And in the Emirates today, you have Malikism is the madhab, as far as I understand. But the last great Maliki of the East, I mean, this isn't something Dutton says, it's just something, is often said to be Qadi Abdul Wahhab, who dies in 422. And after him, I can't think of any kind of... he writes, it's been published as Sharh on the Risala. Yeah, he's a Qadi in Baghdad. He dies in 422. I mean, it's often said he's the last great Maliki of the East. After, it's all Western from there on. I mean, the West would, in this slightly different definition of the West, would include Egypt, of course.
Abu Bakr al-Baqillani obviously passes away before that.
Beginning of the 5th century, Right, I mean, him as he's one of the big three Ash'aris. They all die in the first 2 decades of the 5th century. Abu Ishaq al-Isfara'ini, Ibn Furak al-Baqillani. So I think Baqillani is 406, if I remember rightly, something like that.
My memory's not as good as yours on this, but I mean,
good Usuli, but he's not remembered as a jurist in the way Qadi Abdul Wahhab is.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. MashaAllah. Jazakumullah khair. Do you want to sort of perhaps give us a closing sort of any closing reflections on Dutton's book, and then an introduction to next week's book as well?
Sure. So, I mean, I really enjoyed this book. It's relatively short, but of course there is a great deal of scholarship behind it and underneath it and so on. And there is original content, although of course the author has been writing on these issues for many years now. I've expressed a couple of points of disagreement throughout the course of this slightly longer than usual conversation. But yeah, I would the author is an authority really on what he writes, and in fact has really profoundly shaped future generations working on early Islamic law. I mean, he's made, of course, major contributions as well to the textual history of the Quran, more in various papers of his, but that's not something we have time to touch on, unfortunately. So next week's book, I should say, Barakallahu Fiqh, is the newly published, I'm holding this up right, I hope, Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 2, covering the years 500 to 1420. So it's part of, obviously, a bigger project, the Cambridge History of Slavery, and I will be focusing, of course, on the elements relating to Islamic history and Islamic law. I'm not really so interested in speaking about, slavery in the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. That's less interesting. So I will focus on those chapters, inshallah, next week.
As ever, Jazakallah khair, Omar, for really illuminating usually what is Thursday evenings, but this week I was away, so our Saturday evening this week. We have just one more comment saying Assalamu alaikum. Nice to see you, Shaykh Assalamu wa alaikum assalam to epicologist, whatever that means. And I really look forward to welcoming you in a week, well, less than a week. We'll be back on Thursday as usual. At 6 p.m. UK time, and discussing another sort of bit of light reading, I suppose, but select chapters from this important. I think it's the second volume in a series of 5.
Yeah, I mean the volumes after this one have actually come out.
Already been published. Interestingly enough, I just found that interesting. But Jazakumullah khairan again, and I look forward to seeing you in a week's time, bi'idhnillah. But until then, and I look forward to welcoming comments and questions in a week's time from our viewers. But until then, take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.